This is Show Up as a Leader, a show from People Forward Network, helping you maximize your positive impact on the world by becoming your best, fully authentic self. Hey everyone. One of the things that I am so adamant about is that if we are going to create environments where people can show up as a leader, regardless of their title or role, we have to have fearless environments, meaning we have to intentionally nurture on an ongoing basis psychological safety, where people feel like they can show up and be vulnerable. They can admit mistakes. They can share ideas. And so that's why I'm so excited to have this conversation with Stephan Wiedner. He is a psychological safety expert who has focused on developing sustainable high performance leaders, teams, and organizations. And he's just got such an incredible background. And he gives really practical things that we can do to start to build and nurture psychological safety. So you're going to want to listen for talking about how to leverage the 4-player model. He talks about 2 critical skills that we can build. And I also love that he acknowledges what we talk about a lot about this internal dialogue we have and this innate need we have to protect ourselves, and how we need to recognize that and include that in our work to create higher performing teams, to be more effective leaders, and ultimately have better performance. I think there's a lot of richness in this discussion, as well as some very tangible things that you can take away. All right, Stephan, I'm super excited to be talking to you because one of the things that we talk about when it comes to rehumanizing workplaces is the importance of creating fearless environments. And I'm a huge fan of Amy Edmondson. And I just know we can't do the work we need to show up as a leader if we don't have environments of psychological safety. And that's totally your jam. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you because it's missing way more than people realize in today's day and age. So let's just start off with why you feel psychological safety is so important and how you became so passionate about this work.
We, for a number of years, were conducting coaching engagements within organizations. So organizations would come to us, say, hey, we have these leaders and we'd like to help them, support them in their development and their growth as leaders. And by and large, they were all trying to do things like improve their executive presence or learn how to delegate better or learn how to foster greater teamwork or whatever the ostensible goal was. What I was looking for all that time was a way to ensure that when we worked with these leaders, we could show and demonstrate improvements for the organization. So we wanted to not just show that, hey, the coaching worked and the leader who participated in coaching had a positive experience, but what's the impact on the business? That's what we were really trying to look at. And so I came across the concept of psychological safety. And I thought, even though these people never used the term psychological safety, by and large, every single leader was trying to improve psychological safety because almost every leader that we were working with had a team and were trying to foster greater teamwork. And so then I come across this term and I realize what's so great about psychological safety is that it can be easily measured. We can use it as a pre and post measure for psychological safety. And organizations should care about this because teams with greater psychological safety have better outcomes. And it correlates. So better teams have higher degrees of psychological safety, and lower teams or less effective teams have lower grades of psychological safety. That's how it all connected for me. I just thought, well, this is going to be a better way for us to measure the performance of the coaching that we're doing and delivering to organizations, and organizations should care about this.
Yeah, I think anyone that has not read the work from Google's Project Aristotle, where they measure this, psychological safety is the number one of the 5 or 6 indicators of the effective teams. It's the enabler for dependability and results and accountability to happen, but it's also the gatekeeper. In its absence, you're not going to have those things. One of the things that I appreciate about the work that's being done by so many great people out there, yourself included, is it just keeps reaffirming that psychological safety is not some big nebulous thing. It exists at the local team level, and formal people leaders have the greatest influence over it. How do you start to foster psychological safety? How do you create a safe space where people can take those interpersonal risks and say, hey, I screwed up, or hey, I have a question, or hey, I made a mistake, or whatever it might be? How do you go about then starting to enhance or build psychological safety on teams?
Well, maybe before I answer that question, we want to look at why is psychological safety a thing? Like, why can't we just say, hey, everybody, let's all just speak openly and wave a magic wand and suddenly we're all doing that? Well, it's because we have internally within our brains this need to protect our identities or reputations all the time. Perhaps everyone can relate to that experience of being in a classroom where the teacher asks a question and there's some kids at the front going, oh, pick me, right? And then there's kids at the back who are reluctant. And even if you call upon them, they'll be reluctant to share. And part of that is socialization. But then part of it is this internal dialogue that we all have in our heads that's saying something like, well, what I have doesn't matter. What I have to say doesn't matter. Or, well, I don't want to ask a question because then people are going to think I'm stupid. Or I don't want to make a comment because then I'm going to come across as different from everybody else. We all have these internal dialogues all the time that are shaping whether or not we contribute in any given moment. And it's just part of our natural way of operating in a socialized world. And so overcoming a lot of these natural tendencies that we all have is really tough. So that's, I think, the first thing I want to mention.
Right. And I so appreciate you bringing this up because this is speaking near and dear to my heart. It's impression management. And I think that we fail to realize that it is human to have this internal dialogue, and that internal dialogue that we have that says, oh, don't speak up or don't do this, or trying to manage other people's impression of us. It was formed in the first 10 years of our life, and 70% of studies show that it's flawed. It's negative. It's self-sabotaging. We are hardwired to try to look good and avoid looking bad. And I think that that's so important because it's easy for people to get really judgmental about other people rather than recognizing this is part of the human condition. And so rather than fighting it, it's how can we acknowledge it, but then go, okay, guess what? I'm not 10 years old anymore. And how can we make it safe for people to lean into that discomfort when their brain is saying, no, danger, Will Robinson. And so I think it's super important because when we're in that space, we think it's just us. Oh, it's just me that thinks that my voice doesn't matter. And it's like, no, everybody's got some version of their own impression management going on, and it erodes time and energy in organizations. So I'm super glad that you said that because I think that gets overlooked and we just want to jump to skills, but we have to understand the messy inner stuff if we're going to get to skill building.
Agreed. Yeah. Okay. So we understand that we all have these socialized patterns of behavior. What we try to look at are just that, the patterns of behavior, which are sometimes also called within a group as norms. Most of your listeners are likely familiar with entering a new workplace environment. There's that question of how do we do things around here? And even if we're not explicitly asking it outwardly to other people in the office, we're asking it internally to ourselves and looking around the room and looking around at how things are done. And then we fall into those norms. And so what we see with environments where there is a lack of psychological safety is often that's characterized by politeness. So it's characterized not by people fighting and disagreeing. It's characterized by people just being polite. Yes, okay, sounds good. I'll get right on that. There's no pushback. There's no debate. There's no real challenging of one another. If you notice that within your team, like if you're presenting ideas and everyone's just saying, okay, sounds good, then that's a sign that there's a little too much politeness and not enough candidness that is typically characterized by psychological safety. So that's the first thing to recognize. And if you recognize that, then I think it's really important to start to explicitly create some new norms around how we behave around here. So trying to identify what are some of your core values, if you will, and how do we embrace those? And one of the key factors with psychological safety is how do you reframe sharing ideas or mistakes, errors, and things that don't necessarily go well? Like how do you openly discuss those types of things so that your team can work around them? And so really it's about reframing mistakes and reinforcing that again and again and again. So when someone makes a mistake, you don't just punish them and slap them over the wrist. You say, okay, I'm really pleased that you're bringing this up today. How are we going to work around this? How are we as a team going to solve this problem? And you might look at the specific problem like, oh, we made a mistake in the code, and so now we have this error. And you might want to look at, okay, how are we creating patterns of behavior that will support that kind of error in the future so that perhaps we can catch it sooner, right? So we can mitigate it sooner.
When you're talking about politeness, I think that we need to recognize that politeness is not authenticity or transparency, and it's not effectiveness. I think Amy Edmondson talks about in the lack of psychological safety, it leads to dangerous silence, and people are withholding and they're not speaking up. And I think there can be this misunderstanding or myth about psychological safety on teams that it's all about feeling good and it's like unicorn and rainbows. But to your point, that's not true at all. But the best teams are engaging in healthy debate. They are speaking up when something isn't right. They are admitting when they screw up. They are asking for help, which is a very vulnerable thing to do. So the psychologically safe teams, it's about learning and performance. So how else do we start to create new norms, as you said, for people to speak up? What are some things that people leaders can do? And if someone's not a people leader, what are some things that they could try doing?
Yeah, I think that gets to the root of the problem, right? How do we solve it? The way we look at it is if you consider all the dialogue that occurs within every conversation, we point to this 4-player model developed by David Cantor. And the 4-player model by David Cantor suggests that there's 4 types of communications. There's a mover, there's a follower, there's an opposer, and there's a bystander. So these are the 4 types of communication statements that might be made in any conversation. So a mover is an individual that says, let's do X. I'll give you an example with my family. We have 2 teenage kids. And on a given Friday night, my daughter might say, hey, let's watch a movie tonight. So she's moving, right? She's saying, let's do something. And then my wife will say, okay, sounds great. So she's following. She's just following the mover. And then my son will say, I don't want to watch a movie. Let's do something else. So he's opposing. Then I'll chime in and say, okay, so you want to go to a movie. You are happy to do something as long as we're all together. And well, as the brother, you're just going to oppose your sister no matter what. So I'm the bystander. I'm kind of stepping away from the conversation, shining a light on the dynamics within the conversation. I'm pointing that out because if you consider the mover and the opposer, those folks are typically on the advocacy axis of the conversation, right? They're advocating for one thing or another. Whereas the follower and the bystander are a little bit more on the curiosity side, looking at, okay, what's going on here? What we see is a lot of leaders will consistently think that as the leader, I need to make the call. I need to have the most amount of information. I need to make decisions. What's missing is a little more curiosity and facilitating more dialogue and more communication. Switch your mindset from, as leader, I need to make all decisions and be the smartest person in the room, to, as leader, I need to facilitate dialogue and bring a whole amount of curiosity so that I can understand and appreciate where everyone's coming from and what their perspectives are.
That's like a mic drop moment, because this last week I had several conversations in rooms of hundreds of leaders talking about this. And I'm like, how many of you have some kind of narrative that you have to be able to solve people's problems? You have to have the answers. And so many people are nodding along. And it's that reframing of, we actually add value asking a really good, thoughtful question that we don't know the answer to, which is hugely vulnerable, many times adds way more value than just being a person who actually has the answers. And so I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's a mindset shift of, okay, my role as a formal leader is to find ways to elevate others to greatness. This is not about you being the smartest person in the room. Like, you're going to fail. Like, you surround yourself with really good, smart people and you help them grow and elevate them. And you do that by asking good questions. You do that by being curious. You do that by letting go of the ego that feels like I have to have the answers. So I think that that is huge, and it's easier said than done.
I think 2 of the characteristics and qualities we're looking for in a leader, which of course is professed by Amy Edmondson, is courage and humility. And I think we often think of courage in that kind of military, I'm at the front, like charging into the opposition, right? Just straight out of the movies kind of thing. And that's not necessarily the courage we're talking about. It's the courage to go to places unknown. But I think it's also the courage to demonstrate that you don't have all the answers. That's the courage and humility piece kind of tied together. And I think that's so critical for leaders. You cannot be the smartest person in the room all the time. There'll be some discussions wherein you'll be the most informed individual within your team, and you'll need to exert your expertness in those circumstances. But as a leader, so often you won't, right? There are more subject matter experts in the room that you need to lean on and support them and grow them, just as you said.
And when you talk about courage and humility, I think there is a misconception about courage that it is like the charging in. And here's the thing is even the military, Brene Brown does a ton of work with the military. And they've even said like there is no courage without vulnerability. It's that leaning into uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. If I admit that I am not the smartest person in the room, if I admit I made a mistake, if I lean in and ask questions that I don't necessarily know the answer to, I'm putting myself in the face of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And so I think that vulnerability is so huge to be able to have courage. It forces us to operate with a sense of humility. When you go first as a leader, I'll call it courageous vulnerability. It spreads, it's contagious in a good way. And you give other people permission, or they might say, oh, it's okay for me to fill in the blanks, speak up, admit mistakes. Maybe I don't have to be so attached to that impression management.
Oh, yeah, because we were talking about habits, right? And forming explicit habits and norms within a team. And so if you're modeling the behavior you want to see, absolutely, it will become contagious and others will recognize, oh, it's okay for me to admit that I don't have all the answers as well because our leader just did. I want to come back to that 4-player model because we've trained leaders on this and they come back to it regularly as a really great mental model for them to remind themselves that as the leader, they don't always have to be that mover because that's sort of the default mindset. Often it's, oh, as the leader, I need to be the mover. I need to call the shots, to instead embrace that bystander role. That's not to say you're not going to call the shots and not be the mover. Absolutely. What you want is to expand your range. You want to be more flexible and you want to ask the question, what's needed in this moment, and embrace that bystander role. It's maybe the wrong label for the term because bystander implies inaction. It's a really important role. Maybe the better way to think about it is using the metaphor of the stage and the balcony. So you're dancing on the stage and then there's someone up on the balcony. So as a leader, you need to elevate yourself up onto that balcony so you can look down on the dance floor and shine a light on what's happening on the dance floor. You're not necessarily there to discuss the subject matter of whatever's being discussed, but point out the way in which that subject matter is being discussed. You're sort of elevating yourself and saying, hey, I'm noticing that you two folks seem to be just going back and forth. It's almost like a ping pong match. And I don't see us getting to some sort of resolution if we maintain the status quo here. How are we going to solve this together? How are we going to approach this issue when knowing that there's a couple people in the room that have oppositional points of view and maybe we're not going to find the middle ground? So just shining a light on that will have everybody else in the room go, I'm so glad you mentioned that because gosh, we've been noticing it, right? As everyone's sitting there watching the tennis match go back and forth.
Yeah. We use the metaphor of the dance floor versus the balcony a lot as well. And I think when you can help people get out of that immediacy of just the dance floor and all I can see is my project or my team, and it's very kind of myopic, me focused, it's missing that greater context of here's what's happening elsewhere in the organization or here's what else is going on. And so I do think bringing people up to the balcony to go here, have this broader context. Now you go back down to the dance floor with greater clarity, hopefully greater alignment and greater understanding. It's kind of like the get over yourself and let's make sure we're operating within context that takes other people and other factors into consideration.
Coming back to that question of how do you do that? I want to break it down for people even further. So going up into the balcony, great mental model. But I think there's 2 skills that we really lean on to help people do that. The first skill is what we would call a self-involving statement. Let's say there is that situation where you have 2 people in the room that are going back and forth, they're arguing. And a self-involving statement just says, I'm starting to get frustrated in this moment here. So you're just reflecting how you're feeling. You would do that because there's a very good chance that others are feeling a similar way, right? They might also be feeling frustrated or some other sentiment. That also demonstrates some emotional intelligence, if you will, and some vulnerability, right? To be able to say, I'm feeling frustrated in this moment. So often there's another reason why you would want to use a self-involving statement. It sort of disarms the situation. It's more like, I'm noticing I'm feeling this way internally. The second skill that we would want to lean on is what we call a process comment or reflecting process. So it's that idea of reflecting back to the team, the dynamics that you're seeing. So it's reflecting the process within that team. And so it's, hey, I'm noticing that two people here, you two are going back and forth. Doesn't appear to be a middle ground here. How are we going to resolve this? That last piece, how are we going to resolve this together? That's an open-ended question. So that's another skill that we can practice. But I think everybody would appreciate or already know how to do that. So I think the key important skills are A, self-involving statement, B, process comment. Those are the two things you need to do. And the conversation will take a new turn. Guarantee.
You're right. It is disarming. I've talked to teams we work with and saying things like, I'm really confused. Walk me through, how do we get from point A to point B? Or there's something I'm missing that's not connecting for me, right? So you're not saying you're not explaining it well, or you didn't do a good job. When we put it on us, it almost invites other people to like, hey, help me, because we're modeling that vulnerability. Like, I don't get it, even though it's more of you're trying to understand the thinking process or you're trying to like disarm something. When we put it on ourselves of, help me understand, or I don't get it, or I'm frustrated, or there's something I'm not clear about, it kind of diffuses stuff. So I think that that's something that definitely takes practice.
You're right. It does take practice, and it invites curiosity, right? It invites greater, deeper discussion on the topic. And it's signaling to the other person, I really care about what your perspective is, and I want to make sure I understand it correctly. And if you look at the research around like hostage negotiations, for example, a lot of the theory around that is you have to demonstrate that you understand the other person and that you get it right. And then when you do that, it opens up the door for you to be able to say, okay, well, I get it. What you want is $1 million for these hostages. Well, here's what I want. I want to make sure everybody's going to stay safe here. So how do we get both of these things? You have to give before you can take. You have to show that you understand before you could be understood by others. And that's a fundamental truth about pretty much any type of conversation or negotiation.
Absolutely, because it's a core human need we all have to feel heard and seen and feel like we're valued. And so when somebody doesn't take the time to try to understand us, we shut down. And so when we're like, okay, help me understand, there's something I'm not getting. What are you needing? I'm trying to understand you. I'm trying to learn more about you. Then we can find that win-win. What are you needing? What am I needing? But we can't do that if we feel like someone doesn't see us as a human being, doesn't care about us. And I think in this fast-paced world, that gets lost so much. In this fast-paced world, people are in hyperdrive and they get so focused on the task and being in the dance floor and what they have to get done that we're like, oh, I don't have time to build relationships. I don't have time to ask people about what's going on in their life. I don't have time for it. But if we don't make time to invest in the relationships, the work is going to suffer.
I think that's a really good point, because that is a natural knee-jerk reaction to it, especially if you're making self-involving statements that involve emotions, things that are kind of taboo, don't want to go there. Sometimes leaders will think, gosh, if I'm going to mention my emotions and ask them about theirs, that's going to take forever. I'm going to have to roll out the couch and suddenly become a therapist. That's not what we're saying here at all. What we're saying is you want to acknowledge whatever's there and so that you can move on. If everybody's incredibly frustrated in the room and you don't acknowledge that, that frustration is just going to linger and it's going to fester. It's going to get worse. It's the elephant in the room, and you need to be able to identify it and have the skills to be able to disarm it quickly, because that's how better decisions are made. Discussing the elephant in the room might slow things down in the moment because you have an agenda for the meeting and you want to get through all 12 items. The reality is you will make better, more efficient decisions the more people are willing and able to contribute the critical information that affects the decisions that your team is being asked to make every day. That's what speeds outcomes is. You have better decision making because everyone's sharing the information that needs to be heard and understood and appreciated in the room.
Yeah, well, and we're people first. So I always say you got to check in as human beings and check in on the people side before you go to tasks. So we do a 2-word check-in at the start of every team huddle, like, how are you doing today? And it might be like curious and happy. It might be worried or whatever, but it allows people to check in wherever they're at. And if you hear a lot of frustrated or barely breathing or exhausted, it's like, okay, you know what? We might have these 12 things on our agenda, but guess what? We need to tend to what is going on, because if people are in that state, they can't bring their best thinking to those 12 agenda items. And you know what? Maybe it's okay that we only get to 6, because if we push through, we're not going to make the best decisions. And so I think what I found is that's one way that's a simple, like, how do you start opening up that space for courage and vulnerability is just how do you start your meetings? Do you dive right into agendas, or do you check in with people first to see how they're doing, like authentically check in? So I love that you've got the 2 skills. I love that you got the looking at the 4-player model. Are there any other things like someone could start trying to put into place right now that would start to open up that space of psychological safety on their teams?
Yeah, well, there's another really practical solution, and that is measure psychological safety. It's a 7-question survey that everyone on your team can fill out. And what's so good about it is that it just facilitates open discussion. And one of the great ways, a very simple way to address psychological safety is you can go through every one of the questions that are asked. And it's obvious that there's a quote unquote right answer and a wrong answer, right? So it says, to what degree is this statement true, very true, or not true at all? And you want them to be true 100% of the time. And so you can go through every question and then just ask folks, how do we make sure that we're all answering this question in the affirmative all the time? You'll come up with all sorts of discussions. For example, one of the questions is, does everyone on this team feel appreciated for their differences? And if they're not, well, how might we do that? Like, oh, maybe every month someone should make a presentation about their culture. We're seeing many more international teams where you have people with different cultures, and you want to leave room for everyone to appreciate how everyone's different. And when you do that, people are going to feel more psychologically safe.
We use the 7-question pre-post in some of our team-based programs as kind of a jumping off point. Hey, here's where you're starting, and let's see if the work we use as a measure of success of the program, like did psychological safety improve? But the other thing I love about you're talking about having a dialogue around it, we have the official psychological safety inventory, or we can run reports and do it with teams and have a group dialogue. If someone doesn't want to invest in that, and sometimes there's value, like hiring yourself or myself or other people to do outside facilitation for a variety of reasons. But hopefully, as a leader, if you're creating a safe space to have that courageous dialogue, you can say, like, what's contributing to us feeling like people are valued for their differences on this team? Because we want to nurture those strengths because it can get away from us. But we also then hopefully can have a dialogue of what contributes to you feeling that you aren't valued for your uniqueness. What would make it better? What are things that we could do, right? And it becomes a solution-oriented, hey, we're in this together. So I'm curious, how often do you revisit that? Because what I've learned is that you want to do this periodically because psychological safety isn't static, right? It can have ebbs and flows. And so using it as a check-in of like, hey, where are we doing? Where are things needing to be tended to? How often do you reassess that or encourage teams to relook at those questions?
I think there's a optimal answer and then there's a practical one. And what we've determined is a practical cadence is roughly quarterly. So we've worked with a number of teams over the years that regularly go through quarterly planning, right? The team gets together explicitly. They mark off 1 or 2 or 3 days, depending on whether it's an annual planning session or quarterly planning session. And they'll have that time set aside and they'll start with the psychological safety debrief. That's the first thing they do every time because that's where they want to check in on the team. Quarterly planning requires psychological safety. You're going to have better plans when everyone is feeling psychologically safe. And so that sort of sets the tone for them. They can feel the sense of psychological safety almost waning over the 2 or 3 day period, to be honest. You can see this like slight decline because at the beginning, everyone's like, okay, re-embracing it. And so that points to the fluid nature of it. What happens is these teams will evolve, right? You're adding a new member, maybe someone leaves and you replace them. So you're replacing members, you're adding members, that team is growing. There's all these sort of dynamics that will happen within this changing, living, breathing environment. So you want to maintain a good, solid cadence for measuring psychological safety and debriefing. And I'd say quarterly is about as good as any.
I love that, making it a regular part of like, quarterly planning, quarterly offsites, which we can have a whole other conversation about. Are people having a good meeting cadence that supports both working right in the business and on the business or being on the dance floor and balcony? Because I think if we don't check in periodically, psychological safety and culture both live at the local team level. It's a garden. You have to tend to it. You can't just ignore it and expect stuff. And so the more that you're tending to it, you can catch stuff that might be going in a direction that needs course correcting. And you can lean on the strengths that are helping you and serving you well and create deliberate practices around them so that they hopefully don't get away from you. Going back to when you said what's at the root of people maybe not having psychological safety on their teams, that self-limiting story, the impression management, the wanting to look good, avoid looking bad. One of the things that I am passionate about is normalizing the messiness of being human and the fact that we do all tell ourselves those stories. And so, Stephan, I would love for you to model courageous vulnerability and share with myself and our listeners, what is a self-limiting story that you still tell yourself sometimes? And when it shows up, how do you move beyond it so that you can still show up as a leader in your life?
The one skill that I'm deliberately working on the most is what we call interpersonal responsiveness. So that skill of recognizing, first of all, that there's a potential rupture or some sort of disconnect in the team, and then approaching it and being able to approach it in this productive way that's not pointing the finger and not telling everyone else that they're making mistakes. It's bringing that level of curiosity and vulnerability to it that we talked about earlier. And so for me, that's the thing that I'm most specifically working on, because as a leader, I recognize that I am nice. I was raised in Canada, so maybe politeness, we talk about politeness being perhaps the antithesis of psychological safety, and don't necessarily want to go to those uncomfortable places. And so I'm really trying to recognize in myself when certain topics cause me some form of anxiety, and I approach it anyway. I force myself to just approach it, bring it up, talk about it as soon as possible, because the longer I wait, the more anxiety it starts to induce in myself. And then I just become polite. And I'm charismatic enough, right? I can sort of dance around issues and not address them head on and pretend like they're not there. And that's not a good feeling.
Right? That's the thing. When we have those stories of, oh, I need to be polite, or I need to not rock the boat, or whatever that narrative is that has politeness want to take over, there's a lot of people that have that. There's people that have control issues, like whatever that self-limiting narrative is. But what I love about what you shared is I know this about myself. We're constant works in progress. Like that's never going to go away, but you build the skills to catch yourself sooner. So I love that you're like, I'm noticing it and I'm trying to lean in and not tap out when I notice it. That's courage. So I love that. All right. Are you ready for quick questions?
Sure. Let's do it.
Fill in the blank. Living authentically is?
It is recognizing your values and living by your values, the things that are most important to you.
When the world is presenting an opening, but you don't feel like showing up as a leader, what do?
You do it anyway. Go to that uncomfortable place. You have to show up and meet the opportunity.
Love it. What is something that people would be surprised to know about you?
They would be surprised to know that I'm a volunteer firefighter.
That's fantastic. All right. What's your favorite go-to movie?
Oh, I just watched it. Shawshank Redemption. Such a good story.
All right. What is your go-to song?
Lately, I've been listening to some Red Hot Chili Peppers, and the specific song is Snow.
What is something you can't live without?
My spouse.
What is something in your ordinary daily life that makes your heart happy?
Spending time with the family.
And what are you grateful for right now?
I'm grateful for the rain. I said I was a volunteer firefighter, and so in this spring, I get anxious because if it's really dry, then that means we're going to have a wicked summer of lots of fire and lots of smoke, and that causes me anxiety.
My last question for you is, if you could challenge leaders everywhere to practice this one behavior that would create more human workplaces and equip everyone to show up as a leader, what would that be?
It's to practice that humility of not having the answer and relying on the people around you to answer it. So just asking the question, being able to say, I don't have the answer, so how are we going to solve this together?
I'm Rosie Ward, and this is Show Up as a Leader. To learn more, head over to peopleforwardnetwork.com and, of course, hit that follow button.